The stagecoach wheel cracked like a gunshot against the frozen boulder, sending Clara Hallowell crashing into the opposite bench as the entire coach tilted sickeningly toward the ravine. Through the small window, she glimpsed the chasm yawning below its depths, lost in swirling snow and gathering dusk. The driver's curses cut through the howling wind as he fought to control the spooked horses, their screams echoing off the canyon walls of Dead Crow Basin. Hold on, miss," old Pete Grayson shouted from the driver's seat. "We're gonna have to abandon her here." Clara's gloved fingers found the hidden pocket sewn into her travel skirt, feeling for the crinkled envelope that contained everything she had left in this world. The deed to Hallowell Ranch, formerly Ironjaw Ranch, with the inheritance from a father she'd barely known. Now her only salvation from the scandal that had destroyed her life in Kansas. Tommy Morrison's pale face flashed through her memory. His small body crumpled at the bottom of the schoolhouse steps, his father's accusing finger pointed at her. She pushed him. "That woman killed my boy." The lie had spread like wildfire through Millerville, turning neighbor against neighbor, student against teacher, until Clara had no choice but to flee, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a deed to land she'd never seen. The coach lurched again, and Clara pressed her face to the frosted glass. Through the blizzard, she could make out the skeletal outline of buildings clustered in the valley below. Dead Crow Basin. Even the name felt like an omen. The settlement looked abandoned, half buried in snow, with only a few windows showing the warm glow of lamplight. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys, immediately torn away by the relentless wind. "There she is." Pete called back to her, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Your daddy's old spread. Hallowell Ranch, though most folks still call it by its old name." Clara's breath fogged the window as she strained to see the ranch buildings. A large main house sat dark against the white landscape, its windows black and lifeless. Several outbuildings clustered around it, like huddled cattle. And she could just make out the forms of actual cattle gathered near a barn, their backs caked with snow. It looked desolate, forgotten nothing like the prosperous ranch her father's letters had described years ago. The stagecoach finally ground to a halt at an angle that made Clara's stomach lurch. Pete climbed down his boots, crunching in the deep snow, and yanked open her door. "I'm sorry, miss, but I can't take her any further. Wheels cracked clean through and this storm's getting worse. You'll have to walk the rest of the way." Clara gathered her worn carpet bag and stepped into the knee-deep snow, immediately feeling the cold bite through her thin boots. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving ice crystals into her face. Pete handed down her battered trunk, his expression apologetic but firm. "Our ranch house is maybe half a mile that way," he said, pointing through the swirling white. "Follow the fence line, and miss, be careful. Amos Dray runs that place, now has for near 3 years since your daddy passed. He ain't known for his hospitality to strangers." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Pete had climbed back onto his damaged coach and was urging his horses back toward the main trail, leaving her alone in the storm. She hefted her trunk onto her shoulder, the leather handle cutting into her palm through her thin gloves, and began trudging through the snow toward her inheritance. Each step was a battle against the wind and the accumulating snow that seemed determined to bury her alive. Her skirts quickly became waterlogged and heavy, clinging to her legs and making each movement more difficult. The cold seeped through her wool coat, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. But Clara pushed forward, driven by the memory of her father's voice from his last letter. "The ranch will always be there for you, Clara girl. It's your birthright, your sanctuary when the world turns against you." How prophetic those words seemed now, as she struggled through the blizzard toward a home she'd never seen, fleeing accusations she couldn't disprove, carrying nothing but a deed and a heart full of determination to start over. The fence line materialized out of the white darkness, its posts barely visible above the drifting snow. Clara used it as her guide, stopping every few yards to catch her breath and wipe the ice from her eyelashes. Her trunk felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and more than once she considered abandoning it. But everything she owned was in that trunk: her teaching certificates, her mother's jewelry, the few books she'd managed to save from the fire that had consumed her reputation in Kansas. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the dark bulk of the ranch house emerged from the storm. Light spilled from several windows, warm and inviting, and Clara nearly sobbed with relief. She stumbled up the front steps, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion, and pounded on the heavy wooden door with her numb fist. The door opened to reveal a man in his early 40s, tall and lean with prematurely gray hair, and the hardest eyes Clara had ever seen. His face was weathered and scarred with a jagged mark running from his left temple to his jaw. He held a rifle casually in one hand, as if opening doors, while armed, was perfectly normal. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Clara Hallowell," she managed through chattering teeth. "This is my father's ranch. I have the deed." Something flickered across the man's face: surprise, anger, or perhaps something deeper and more complicated. He stepped back, allowing her to enter, and Clara stumbled into the warmth of the ranch house's main room. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, and the air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and leather. "Amos Dray," the man said, setting his rifle against the wall, but keeping his eyes fixed on Clara. "I've been managing this place since Josiah passed. Didn't know he had any kin left." Clara fumbled in her skirt pocket and produced the deed, her fingers so numb she could barely grasp the paper. "He was my father. He left me the ranch in his will." Amos took the document and studied it by the firelight, his expression unreadable. Around the room, Clara noticed several other men watching the exchange, with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. A heavy-set man with a thick Russian accent sat at a table meticulously cleaning a revolver. A younger man, barely out of his teens, perched nervously on a wooden crate near the fire, his eyes darting between Amos and Clara like he expected violence to erupt at any moment. "This appears to be in order," Amos said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "Though I have to say, Miss Hallowell, your timing could be better. We're in the middle of a bad storm. It's nearly spring roundup, and this ranch barely makes enough to feed the men we have. We weren't exactly prepared for guests." "I'm not a guest," Clara said, finding her voice and her spine simultaneously. "This is my property. I intend to live here and help run it." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The young man by the fire, Pete Daniels, she would later learn, shifted uncomfortably, while the Russian man, Dmitry Volkov, paused in his gun cleaning to stare at her with open amazement. "Run it," Amos repeated, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice, though it wasn't the pleasant kind. "Miss Hallowell, this isn't some gentleman's farm back east. This is a working cattle ranch in some of the harshest country God ever made. We lose men to weather, to accidents, to rustlers, and worse things that come out of the Badlands. What exactly do you think you could contribute to an operation like this?" Before Clara could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the kitchen, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 50, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a simple brown dress protected by a flour-dusted apron. Her face was kind, but weathered, with laugh lines around her dark eyes and calluses on her hands that spoke of years of hard work. "¿Qué está pasando aquí?" the woman asked, and then switched to accented English when she saw Clara. "Who is this poor child standing here soaked to the bone?" "Rosa Gutierrez, meet Clara Hallowell." Amos said, his tone now carrying a mocking edge. "Apparently she's Josiah's daughter, and she's here to help us run the ranch." Rosa's expression immediately softened, and she bustled forward to take Clara's wet coat. "Dios mío, you're freezing, child. Come to the kitchen. I'll make you something hot." She shot a sharp look at Amos. You men standing here arguing while this poor girl turns to ice. No manners, any of you. Clara allowed herself to be led to the warm kitchen, where Rosa immediately set about preparing hot coffee and a plate of food. The older woman's kindness was a balm after the hostility she'd sensed from Amos, and Clara found herself relaxing slightly for the first time since leaving Kansas. "Don't mind Amos," Rosa said quietly as she worked. "He's had a hard life, that one. But he's kept this place running when it should have failed a dozen times over. Your father, may he rest in peace, he trusted Amos with everything." "What happened to my father?" Clara asked, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup Rosa placed before her. "His letters stopped coming 3 years ago, and then I got word he was dead, but no details." Rosa's face clouded over. "A hard winter, the worst anyone could remember. We lost half the herd, and your father, he went out in a blizzard to try to save the rest. They found him 3 days later, frozen solid, not 100 yards from the south pasture gate. Some say he got turned around in the whiteout, but..." She lowered her voice even further. "Some say other things." "What kind of other things?" Before Rosa could answer, Amos appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. "Rosa, the men need their supper. And Miss Hallowell, we need to discuss your situation." Clara followed him back to the main room where more men had gathered. She counted 8 in total, a rough-looking bunch with the hard faces and careful movements of men who lived dangerously. Most wore guns, and all of them watched her with the wary attention of predators evaluating potential prey. "Boys," Amos announced, "meet Clara Hallowell. She claims to be Josiah's daughter and says she owns this ranch." A murmur ran through the group, and Clara noticed several exchanged glances that seemed to carry meaning she couldn't interpret. The young man she'd noticed earlier, Pete Daniels, looked particularly uncomfortable, while Dmitry Volkov continued to stare at her with undisguised fascination. "In Russia," Dmitry said suddenly, his accent thick as molasses, "we have story about woman who comes from storm bringing change to house of men. Sometimes change is good. Sometimes," he shrugged eloquently, "sometimes house burns down." "Well, this isn't Russia," Amos said sharply. "And Miss Hallowell isn't some character from a folk tale. She's a woman alone in rough country, and she needs to understand what that means." He turned to Clara, his gray eyes hard as winter stone. "Here's the situation, Miss Hallowell. That deed might give you legal claim to this land, but it doesn't mean much in practical terms. This ranch is deeply in debt. We're barely breaking even, and that's with a crew of experienced men who know how to work cattle and handle trouble. We're not a finishing school, and we're not a charity. If you want to stay, you'll have to pull your weight, and I mean really pull it." "Can you shoot?" "I can learn," Clara said, lifting her chin. "Can you rope brand cattle deliver a breeched calf ride 20 miles in a day through country that'll kill you if you make one wrong turn?" Clara's silence was answer enough, and Amos nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. Look, Miss Hallowell, I don't know what your situation was back east, but this isn't a place for someone with delicate sensibilities. This is hard country, and it makes hard people. If you're smart, you'll sell me your share of the ranch and take the money back to civilization. And if I don't want to sell," something cold flickered in Amos's eyes, "then you'll learn real quick why they call this place Dead Crow Basin." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. But she'd come too far and lost too much to back down now. "I'm not selling, Mr. Dray. This ranch was my father's life's work, and now it's mine. I'll learn whatever I need to learn." Amos studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your funeral. Rosa will show you where you can sleep tonight. Tomorrow we'll see how long your determination lasts when you're facing reality instead of dreams." As the men dispersed to their evening routines, Clara caught Pete Daniels watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was sympathy there, but also something that might have been fear. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, busying himself with checking his rifle. Rosa led Clara to a small room at the back of the house, simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest. "This was your father's room when he first came here," Rosa explained, "before he built the big bedroom upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and private." After Rosa left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the deed from her pocket, studying it by candlelight. The paper was yellow with age, and her father's signature looked faded and distant. Josiah Hallowell. She could barely remember his face, just impressions of a tall man with kind eyes who'd visit occasionally when she was very young, bringing presents and stories of the West before disappearing again into his other life. Now that other life was her only option, and she was beginning to understand that Josiah's letters had painted a far rosier picture than reality provided. The ranch was clearly struggling, the men were hostile or suspicious, and Amos Dray radiated a barely contained violence that made her skin crawl. But what choice did she have? She couldn't go back to Kansas, not with Tommy Morrison's death hanging over her like a curse. Outside her window, the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in its howling voice, Clara thought she could hear her father's ghost either welcoming her home or warning her away. She pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and tried to sleep, but every creak of the old house made her wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. She was just beginning to drift off when she heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door. They paused directly outside, and Clara held her breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on. But not before she heard something that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of someone testing her door handle, finding it locked, and moving away with obvious reluctance. Clara lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, and wondering who had been outside her door and what they might have wanted. Dawn came gray and bitter, with the storm finally beginning to exhaust itself into scattered flurries. Clara dressed quickly in her most practical clothes, a dark wool skirt, thick cotton blouse, and the sturdy boots she'd worn for walking to school in Kansas. She braided her dark hair back severely and steeled herself for whatever the day might bring. In the kitchen, she found Rosa already preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. The older woman smiled warmly and poured Clara a cup of coffee without being asked. "You look better this morning, mija. More rested." Clara decided not to mention her midnight visitor. "Rosa, can you tell me more about my father's death? You started to say something last night." Rosa's smile faded, and she glanced toward the doorway before leaning closer. "Your father, he was a good man, but he had enemies. There were men who wanted this land, who thought a single man with no family couldn't hold it. When you stopped writing, when there was no word from you for so long, they thought maybe he really was alone. But I did write," Clara protested. "Every month, just like always. Sigh, but your letters, they stopped coming. At least Josiah never got them. He used to check the mail himself every week in town, and for the last year of his life, he got nothing from you. It broke his heart, I think. He used to say maybe his daughter had found a new life and didn't need her old father anymore." A cold suspicion began to form in Clara's mind. Who collected the mail when my father couldn't make the trip to town? Usually Amos, or sometimes... Rosa stopped abruptly as the man himself entered the kitchen. "Ladies," Amos said with mock courtesy, "I hate to interrupt, but we have work to do. Miss Hallowell, if you're serious about learning to run this place, you can start by helping Rosa with the cooking and cleaning. It's about the only job here that won't get you killed." Clara bristled at the dismissive tone, but before she could respond, Rosa placed a warning hand on her arm. "Of course, Amos. Clara will be a great help to me." Amos nodded curtly and left them alone, but not before Clara caught a look in his eyes that sent ice through her veins. It was the look of a man who saw her as a problem to be solved, one way or another. The morning passed quietly as Clara helped Rosa prepare meals and tend to household chores. Through the kitchen window, she could see the ranch hands going about their business, checking on the cattle, repairing storm damage, and generally doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. Pete Daniels seemed to find excuses to pass by the kitchen frequently, and each time he did, he would glance through the window with an expression of barely concealed worry. Around midday, as Clara was hanging laundry on a line behind the house, she heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw a lone rider approaching through the melting snow. He was a tall, lean man, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors, and he rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. As he drew closer, Clara could see that he was part Indian Cheyenne. She thought based on his features and the way he wore his long black hair. He dismounted near the kitchen door and walked with a pronounced limp favoring his left leg. His dark eyes found Clara immediately studying her with an intensity that was neither hostile nor friendly, just completely evaluating. "You would be Josiah's daughter," he said, his voice carrying no accent, but somehow sounding different from the other men she'd met. There was a formality to his speech, as if English wasn't his first language, even though he spoke it perfectly. "I'm Clara Hallowell," she said, extending her hand. "And you are Miguel Santos," he replied, taking her hand in a brief, firm grip. "Though most folks call me by my English name, I was a friend of your father's." There was something in the way he said "friend" that suggested a deeper connection, and Clara found herself studying his face more carefully. He appeared to be in his mid-30s with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from a hard life, lived honestly. But there was also a sadness in his dark eyes, a weight that spoke of old losses and older responsibilities. "I'm sorry for your loss," Miguel continued. "Josiah was a good man. He saved my life once many years ago." Before Clara could ask for details, Amos emerged from the barn, his expression darkening as he saw Miguel. "What do you want, Santos?" "Just paying my respects to Josiah's daughter," Miguel replied calmly. "I heard she'd finally come home." "Well, you've paid them. Now you can move along." Clara noticed the tension between the two men, thick as smoke and twice as dangerous. Miguel's hand rested casually near his gun, while Amos had assumed the stance of a man ready for trouble. But Miguel simply nodded politely to Clara and prepared to mount his horse. "Miss Hallowell," he said, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease despite his injured leg. "If you ever need anything at all, you can find me at the old Navajo ruins about 5 miles northeast of here. Your father knew the place. I think you would too if you looked." With that cryptic statement, he rode away, leaving Clara with more questions than answers, and Amos glaring at his retreating figure with undisguised hatred. "Stay away from him," Amos warned. "He's trouble. Bad blood between his people and the settlers around here." "He seemed perfectly polite to me," Clara said. "That's what makes him dangerous." Amos turned away, then paused. "Miss Hallowell, let me give you some advice. This country is full of people who'll smile to your face and put a knife in your back. Your father learned that lesson too late. Don't make the same mistake." The rest of the day passed without incident, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. The ranch hands went about their business with the grim efficiency of men who'd learned to expect trouble, and conversations died whenever she appeared. That evening, as she was helping Rosa clean up after supper, Clara finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her all day. "Rosa, what did Miguel mean when he said my father knew the Navajo ruins?" Rosa's hand stilled on the dish she was washing. "Your father, he had many secrets, Misha. Not bad secrets, but complicated ones. The ruins, they were special to him. He used to go there when he needed to think to remember. Remember what? His other family. Clara's blood turned to ice water. Other family. Rosa realized what she'd revealed and pressed her lips together firmly. I've said too much. Some stories are not mine to tell, but the damage was done. Clara's mind was racing, trying to process this new information. Her father had had another family, here in Dead Crow Basin. The implications were staggering, and they cast everything she thought she knew about Josiah Hallowell in a completely different light. That night, Clara lay awake again. But this time, it wasn't fear keeping her from sleep. It was a burning need to understand the truth about her father and his life at Hallowell Ranch. She'd come here thinking she was claiming a simple inheritance, but clearly the situation was far more complicated than she'd imagined. Around midnight, she heard the soft footsteps again, pausing outside her door. This time, however, she was ready. Clara slipped quietly from her bed and pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. She could hear someone breathing on the other side, slow and deliberate, as if they were struggling with some internal decision. Finally, so quietly she almost missed it, came a whispered voice. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry." Before she could respond or even identify the speaker, the footsteps moved away, leaving her alone with a mystery that seemed to deepen with every passing hour. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of weather that made every breath visible and turned exposed skin numb within minutes. Clara dressed warmly and joined Rosa in the kitchen, determined to get answers to at least some of her questions. She began carefully. "Last night someone came to my door. Someone who seemed to know me, who apologized for something. Do you have any idea who that might have been?" Rosa's face went white. "Dios mío, Clara, you must be very careful. There are things happening here, things that started long before you arrived. Your father's death, it wasn't just the storm that killed him." Before Clara could press for details, Pete Daniels burst through the kitchen door, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. "Miss Hallowell, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at the South Pasture." Clara grabbed her coat and followed Rosa and Pete out into the frigid morning air. A group of ranch hands had gathered near the main corral, their voices carrying across the snow-covered ground in agitated discussion. As they approached, Clara could see Dmitry Volkov kneeling beside something in the snow, his usually impassive face creased with concern. "What happened?" Rosa asked, pushing through the circle of men. Dmitry looked up, his pale blue eyes serious. "Is Jake Morrison?" "We found him this morning by the fence line unconscious. Looks like his horse threw him, but..." He gestured helplessly at the scene. Clara moved closer and saw a man lying motionless in the snow, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Jake Morrison. She remembered the name from Rosa's conversation the day before. But what caught her attention wasn't the injured man, it was the condition of his horse, which stood nearby with obvious signs of being deliberately spooked. The animal's eyes were wild, its coat flecked with foam, and there were marks on its flanks that looked suspiciously like they'd been made by a whip or stick. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly. The conversation around her stopped abruptly, and she found herself the focus of 7 pairs of hostile eyes. Amos pushed through the group, his face thunderous. "What did you say?" Clara pointed at the horse. "Look at those marks. Someone deliberately spooked that animal. Jake Morrison didn't have an accident, someone tried to hurt him." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Dmitry spoke up, his Russian accent thick with tension. "In my country, we have saying, when wolf comes to henhouse, he does not announce himself with howling. But sometimes fresh eyes see what old eyes miss." Amos's face was a study in barely controlled rage. "Miss Hallowell, you've been here exactly 2 days. Don't presume to tell us how to read sign or interpret accidents. Jake's horse is known to be skittish, and the cold weather makes all the animals unpredictable. But Clara had spent years teaching children, and she knew the difference between truth and deflection. Then explain why someone was outside my room last night, apologizing for something. Explain why my letters to my father stopped reaching him. Explain why a man who supposedly died in a blizzard was found only 100 yards from safety. The words hung in the air like accusations, and Clara saw fear flicker across several faces. Pete Daniels in particular looked like he might be sick, while even Dimitri's usual stoicism cracked slightly. Amos stepped closer to Clara, his gray eyes flat and cold. "Miss Hallowell, I think the isolation and stress of coming to a new place has affected your judgment. You're seeing conspiracies where there are only accidents, hearing apologies where there was probably just wind through the walls. Perhaps you should consider my offer to buy out your share of the ranch. This clearly isn't the place for someone of your delicate constitution." But Clara had gone too far to back down now. "I'm not leaving, Mr. Dray, and I'm not crazy. Something is very wrong here, and I intend to find out what it is." Amos stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Hallowell. But let me give you one more piece of advice. Curiosity killed the cat. And in country like this, dead cats don't get second chances." As the group dispersed to carry Jake Morrison back to the ranch house, Clara noticed Pete Daniels hanging back, his face pale with obvious internal struggle. She waited until the others were out of earshot, then approached him carefully. "Pete, was it you outside my door last night?" The young man's face crumpled, and for a moment Clara thought he might cry. "Miss Hallowell, I can't. If Amos knew I was talking to you, then don't let him know. But Pete, if you know something about what happened to my father or what's happening now, please tell me. Jake Morrison could have been killed today." Pete glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Meet me tonight at the old well behind the barn, after midnight when everyone's asleep. But Miss Hallowell, if anyone sees us together, we're both dead. I mean that literally." With that ominous warning, Pete hurried away, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and a growing certainty that her arrival at Hallowell Ranch had triggered something that had been building for years. Whatever secrets lay buried in the snow-covered ground of Dead Crow Basin, she was determined to uncover them no matter the cost. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Clara helped Rosa tend to Jake Morrison, who remained unconscious but stable, while the ranch hands went about their business with the grim efficiency she was beginning to recognize as their default mode. But underneath the routine, she could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam boiler. Several times she caught men watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile, to something that might have been pity. Dmitry Volkov seemed particularly troubled, muttering to himself in Russian and casting worried glances in her direction. Even Rosa appeared nervous, jumping at unexpected sounds and constantly checking the locks on doors and windows. As evening approached, Clara excused herself early, claiming exhaustion from the morning's excitement. She lay in her narrow bed, fully dressed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Gradually, the conversations in the main room died away. Footsteps moved through the hallways and doors closed as the ranch hands retired for the night. At 5 minutes past midnight, Clara slipped from her room and made her way quietly to the kitchen door. The night was clear and brutally cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamond chips on black velvet. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air as she picked her way carefully across the snow-covered yard toward the old well Pete had mentioned. The well was exactly where he'd indicated, a circular stone structure half hidden behind the main barn. Pete was already there, pacing nervously and starting at every shadow. When he saw Clara, his relief was palpable. "Thank God you came," he whispered. "I wasn't sure you would. Tell me what you know, Pete. What really happened to my father?" Pete looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "Your father, he wasn't alone when he died. Amos was with him that night, claimed he was trying to help bring in the cattle. But Miss Hallowell, I saw them leave together, and only Amos came back." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Are you saying Amos killed my father? I'm saying I don't know what happened out there in the storm, but your father and Amos had been arguing a lot before that night. Something about letters that weren't being delivered about money that was missing from the ranch accounts. Your father accused Amos of stealing from him and Amos. Well, Amos doesn't take accusations well. Then why haven't you told anyone? Why haven't you gone to the sheriff? Pete's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Bale owes Amos money, Miss Hallowell. More than he could repay in 10 years. And besides, I don't have any proof, just suspicions and a bad feeling in my gut. Clara absorbed this information, feeling the pieces of an ugly puzzle starting to fall into place. Pete, there's something else. Rosa mentioned that my father had another family. Do you know anything about that? Pete's face went white in the starlight. Oh God, you don't know. He never told you. Told me what? Miss Hallowell, Amos isn't just the ranch foreman. He's your father's son, your half-brother. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, and she had to grab the stone edge of the well to keep from falling. That's impossible. Your father had a relationship with a local woman, Maria Dray, about 30 years ago. Before he married your mother, before he moved east. Amos was born from that relationship, but Josiah never acknowledged him officially. Mariah died when Amos was still young, and he grew up knowing his father was the rich rancher who wouldn't claim him. Clara's mind reeled. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. Amos's resentment, his knowledge of the ranch, his strange reaction when she'd arrived with the deed. But if he's my father's son, why would he kill him? He'd inherit everything anyway. Not if your father found out about the missing money and the intercepted letters. Amos has been skimming from the ranch accounts for years, and he's been keeping your letters from reaching your father to make sure Josiah thought you'd abandoned him. If your father had lived long enough to change his will. Pete didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. Amos had killed their father to protect his inheritance and his crimes. And now she was here, legitimate and documented heir to everything Amos had schemed and murdered to possess. Pete, you have to help me get word to the authorities. Real authorities, not Sheriff Bale. Miss Hallowell, the nearest federal marshal, is 3 days' ride through country Amos knows better than anyone. And even if we could get word out, what proof do we have? It's all suspicion and hearsay. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking furiously. The missing money. There must be records, documents. If Amos has been stealing from the ranch, there has to be evidence. He keeps all the books in his office in the main house. But Miss Hallowell, you can't just... A sound from the direction of the house made them both freeze. Footsteps moving across the snow with deliberate stealth. Pete grabbed Clara's arm, his face white with terror. Someone's coming. We have to go now. They separated immediately. Pete melting away into the shadows near the barn, while Clara made her way carefully back toward the house. But as she approached the kitchen door, she saw a figure standing motionless near the corner of the building, obviously waiting. Clara's heart nearly stopped when she recognized Amos's silhouette against the star-filled sky. He stood perfectly still like a predator that had caught a scent, and Clara realized with sickening certainty that he knew exactly what she'd been doing. Evening, Miss Hallowell. Amos said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the still night air. Trouble sleeping again. Clara forced herself to sound calm. I needed some fresh air. It gets stuffy in the house. I see. And did Pete Daniels need fresh air too? I noticed he seems to have trouble sleeping as well. The casual tone made Clara's blood run cold. I don't know what you mean. Amos stepped closer, and in the starlight, Clara could see the gun in his hand, held casually but ready. Miss Hallowell, I've been very patient with you. I've tried to be reasonable to give you a chance to leave peacefully. But you seem determined to stir up trouble, to ask questions that don't need asking. Questions about my father's death, among other things. Amos was close now, close enough that Clara could see the cold calculation in his gray eyes. You know, don't you? Pete told you. Clara lifted her chin, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. I know you're my half-brother. I know you killed our father. For a moment, Amos's facade slipped, and Clara saw the raw pain and rage underneath. He was never my father. He was just the man who rutted with my mother and then abandoned us both. I worked this ranch for 20 years, made it profitable, kept it alive when it should have died. And what did I get? The title of foreman while he wrote letters to his real daughter back east, the one he actually cared about. So you intercepted my letters. You made him think I'd forgotten him. I made him face reality. You never cared about this place or him until you needed somewhere to run. But it was too late by then. I'd already invested too much, sacrificed too much to let some Eastern schoolmarm waltz in and take everything I'd earned. Clara could hear the madness creeping into Amos's voice, the sound of a man who'd convinced himself that murder was justified. What about Jake Morrison? Did you try to kill him too? Jake was getting suspicious, asking too many questions about that night in the storm. Sometimes people need reminders about the dangers of curiosity. Amos raised the gun slightly, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice spoke from the darkness behind him. Step away from her, Amos. Miguel Santos emerged from the shadows near the barn, moving with surprising stealth despite his injured leg. His own gun was drawn and aimed steadily at Amos's back. Santos, Amos said without turning around. Should have known you'd stick your nose in where it doesn't belong. Josiah saved my life once. I owed him a debt, and I pay my debts. That includes protecting his daughter. His daughter is a problem that needs solving. Not tonight. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Amos slowly lowered his gun and turned to face Miguel. This isn't over, Santos. And it's not over for you either, Miss Hallowell. This ranch has been in my blood for 20 years. I'm not giving it up without a fight. With that, Amos walked away, disappearing into the house and leaving Clara alone with Miguel under the cold stars. Thank you. Clara whispered, her voice shaking with reaction. How did you know? I've been watching the ranch for weeks, ever since I heard Josiah's daughter was coming. Your father asked me to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. I think he suspected Amos might try something. Miguel holstered his gun and studied Clara's face in the starlight. You can't stay here tonight. Amos won't try anything with witnesses around, but he's desperate now. Desperate men do stupid things. Where can I go? The ruins I mentioned. There's a shelter there, supplies. Your father prepared it as a hideout in case trouble ever came to the ranch. Clara looked back at the house, thinking of Rosa sleeping inside, unaware of the danger. I can't leave Rosa. And what about Pete? If Amos suspects he talked to me, Pete is smart enough to keep his head down for now. And Rosa has survived 20 years in this country by knowing when to see nothing and hear nothing. But you're the immediate threat to Amos's plans. You're the one who needs to disappear at least until we can get help. Clara knew Miguel was right, but the idea of running again, of abandoning another home to fear and violence, made her sick. How long? A few days, maybe a week. There's a federal marshal who comes through the territory every month. If we can get word to him, present him with evidence. What evidence? Pete said it's all just suspicion. Miguel was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Your father gave me this the week before he died. He'd been suspicious of Amos for months, keeping his own records. Clara unfolded the paper and saw her father's handwriting documenting discrepancies in the ranch accounts, missing money, and intercepted mail. It wasn't enough to convict Amos of murder, but it was certainly enough to raise serious questions. Why didn't you give this to someone before now? Because I needed to be sure you were who you claimed to be. There have been imposters before, people who tried to claim inheritances that weren't theirs. But you're definitely Josiah's daughter. You have his eyes, his stubborn streak. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling slightly. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. Now we need to go. Get whatever you can't live without from your room, but be quick and quiet about it. Clara slipped back into the house and gathered her few possessions, including the original deed and what little money she had left. As she was preparing to leave, she heard a soft knock on her door and froze. "Clara, mija, it's Rosa. I need to talk to you." Clara opened the door to find the older woman standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour. Rosa's face was creased with worry and fear. "I heard voices outside," Rosa whispered. "I saw Amos with his gun. Nina, you are in terrible danger." "I know. Miguel is helping me get to safety." Rosa nodded, then pressed something into Clara's hands. It was a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. "Your father gave me this before he died. Told me to give it to you if you ever came here and needed help. He said he was afraid of what Amos might do if he ever felt threatened." Clara hugged the older woman tightly. "Rosa, will you be safe here? Amos needs someone to cook and clean. As long as I keep my mouth shut and my eyes down, I'll be fine. But Nina, be very careful. Amos is not just angry about the money or the ranch. There's something else, something deeper, that drives his hatred. I think he blames your father for everything that went wrong in his life, and now he blames you." With that warning, Rosa slipped back to her room, leaving Clara to make her escape into the cold night. Miguel was waiting by the barn with 2 horses, and they rode out silently, following a path that led northeast toward the Navajo ruins he'd mentioned. The ride took nearly 2 hours through rough country, following game trails and creek beds that would be difficult to track. Miguel rode with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle, guiding them through terrain that would have been impossible for Clara to navigate alone. The ruins, when they finally reached them, were more extensive than Clara had expected. Ancient stone walls rose from a natural shelf of rock, protected on 3 sides by steep cliffs and overlooking a valley that stretched for miles in every direction. Miguel led her to a section that had been partially restored with a roof and walls that would provide shelter from the elements. "Your father found this place years ago and fixed it up as a retreat," Miguel explained as he helped her dismount. "He said it reminded him of something, but he never told me what." Inside the shelter, Clara found supplies carefully stored in sealed containers, food, water, blankets, even a small cache of weapons. There was also a wooden box that contained more of her father's papers, including what appeared to be a journal. "He came here to write," Miguel said, noticing her interest in the journal. Sometimes he'd stay for days just thinking and writing, and trying to figure out how to fix the mess his life had become. Clara opened the journal and read the first entry, dated just 3 months before her father's death. The handwriting was shaky, but recognizable. "I fear I have created a monster in Amos. My neglect of him as a child, my failure to acknowledge him properly, has twisted him into something I barely recognize. But I cannot let him destroy everything I've built, everything I hope to leave to Clara. If something happens to me, if my suspicions prove correct, then she must know the truth about her half-brother and the danger he represents." Clara closed the journal, feeling the weight of her father's regret and fear. "Miguel, how long were you friends with my father?" "About 15 years. I met him when I was running from some trouble of my own, and he gave me a place to stay when no one else would. Later, when I became a deputy marshal, I'd stop by whenever my circuit brought me through Dead Crow Basin." "You're a deputy marshal?" Miguel nodded. "I was. Lost the position when I was injured last year, but I still have contacts in the service. That's how I plan to get help for you." Clara felt a surge of hope. "How long will it take?" "Marshal Hendricks is due through Coldwater Springs in 5 days. If I can get word to him, he'll come investigate." "But Clara, you need to understand, even with your father's notes and my testimony proving murder is going to be difficult. Amos is well connected in the territory, and he's had 3 years to cover his tracks." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need more than suspicion and accounting discrepancies. We need something that directly connects Amos to your father's death, something that can't be explained away or dismissed. Clara studied the ancient stone walls around her, thinking hard. Miguel, where exactly was my father's body found? About 100 yards from the south pasture gate, near a stand of cottonwoods. Why? Because that doesn't make sense. If he was trying to save cattle in a blizzard, why would he be heading away from the herd toward the trees? Miguel's expression sharpened with interest. What are you thinking? I'm thinking maybe my father wasn't trying to save cattle that night. Maybe he was trying to escape from something or someone. The implications hung between them like smoke from a campfire. If Josiah Hallowell had been running from Amos when he died, it changed everything about that night in the storm. We need to examine that site, Clara said. Spring thaw is starting. Maybe the snow will reveal something that's been hidden all winter. Miguel nodded slowly. It's dangerous. If Amos realizes what we're doing, he's already planning to kill me anyway. At least this way I might be able to expose the truth before I die. Miguel studied her face in the lamplight, seeing something there that reminded him powerfully of Josiah Hallowell. Your father would be proud of you. Then let's make sure his death wasn't for nothing. They spent the rest of the night planning their investigation of the death site, going over every detail Miguel could remember about the discovery of Josiah's body and the condition of the scene. As dawn approached, they agreed that Miguel would return to town to send word to Marshal Hendricks while Clara remained hidden at the ruins. But as Miguel prepared to leave, Clara made a decision that surprised them both. I'm coming with you. Clara, that's suicide. Amos will be watching every approach to the ranch. Maybe. But I know that ranch better than you do now, and I know the people. If we're going to find evidence, we need to move fast before Amos has time to destroy whatever might be left. Miguel saw the determination in her eyes and recognized the futility of argument. If we do this, we do it my way. You follow my lead, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood. Understood. They rode back toward Hallowell Ranch as the sun climbed higher, staying to the rough country and avoiding the main trails. Miguel's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable, guiding them through hidden canyons and across ridges that provided concealment while still allowing them to observe the ranch below. From their vantage point on a hill overlooking the valley, Clara could see unusual activity around the ranch buildings. Men were moving with purpose, and several were armed with rifles rather than the typical revolvers most cowboys carried. Amos is getting ready for something, Miguel observed, studying the scene through a small telescope. Those aren't all ranch hands down there. I recognize at least 3 men who are known gun-for-hire types. He's bringing in reinforcements, which means he's planning to make his move soon, probably before word can get out about what really happened to your father. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Miguel, what about the people in town? If Amos is desperate enough to hire gunmen, he won't hurt anyone who keeps their mouth shut and their eyes closed. But anyone who might be willing to testify against him. Miguel didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. They made their way carefully down the hillside, using the network of arroyos and dry creek beds to approach the south pasture where Josiah's body had been found. The area was exactly as Miguel had described open grassland, with a single stand of cottonwood trees near what remained of an old fence line. The spring thaw had indeed revealed details that had been hidden under the winter snow. Clara and Miguel began a systematic search of the area, looking for anything that might shed light on what had happened that terrible night 3 years ago. It was Clara who found the first piece of evidence, a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch of one of the cottonwoods. The fabric was wool dark blue and showed signs of having been pulled loose by someone moving quickly through the trees. My father's winter coat was brown, Clara said, examining the fabric carefully. This is from someone else's clothes. Miguel nodded and then pointed to the base of the tree where the fabric had been caught. Look at the bark here. Scuff marks, recent ones that wouldn't have survived the winter weather. Someone climbed this tree probably to get a better view of something. Clara felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. A lookout. Someone was waiting here watching for my father. They continued their search and found more evidence of recent activity: cigarette butts that had been protected from the weather by an overhang of rock boot prints preserved in a patch of clay that had been frozen all winter, and most damning of all, the remains of a small campfire that had been carefully concealed among the rocks. This was planned, Miguel said grimly. Someone waited here for hours, maybe days, watching the ranch and waiting for the right opportunity. But how can we prove it was Amos? Miguel held up one of the cigarette butts, pointing to the distinctive paper and tobacco mixture. These are hand-rolled with a specific type of Turkish tobacco. Expensive stuff, not what most ranch hands would smoke. But I've seen Amos with cigarettes exactly like this. Clara felt a surge of excitement mixed with dread. They were finally building a case against Amos, but they were also running out of time. We need to get this evidence to Marshal Hendricks. Agreed. But first, let's see if we can find anything else. If Amos was waiting here for your father, there might be. Miguel's words were cut off by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. They looked toward the ranch and saw a group of men riding hard in their direction, led by a figure Clara recognized even at a distance as Amos Dray. They've spotted us, Miguel said, already moving toward their horses. We need to go now. But as they reached their mounts, Clara realized they had a problem. The approaching riders were between them and their escape route back to the ruins, and the open pasture offered no concealment for a running fight. Miguel were not going to outrun them. Miguel assessed their situation with the practiced eye of a former lawman, then pointed toward a rocky outcropping about 200 yards away. There. We can make a stand from those rocks, maybe hold them off long enough for help to arrive. What help? I sent word to some friends before we left the ruins. If we're not back by noon, they'll come looking. They spurred their horses toward the rocks, Clara clinging to her saddle and praying they could reach cover before Amos's men got within rifle range. Behind them, she could hear shouting and the rapid drum of hoofbeats on hard ground. They reached the outcropping with bullets already whining off the stones around them. Miguel hauled Clara from her horse and pushed her behind the largest boulder, just as a rifle shot cracked from the approaching riders. "Stay down and keep your head covered," Miguel shouted over the gunfire. He had his own rifle out now, using the rocks for cover as he returned fire with deliberate, aimed shots. Clara pressed herself against the cold stone and tried to make sense of what was happening. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see Amos and at least 6 other men spreading out around their position, using the terrain to their advantage. These weren't panicked ranch hands. They were experienced fighters who knew how to conduct a siege. Clara Hallowell. Amos's voice carried clearly across the open ground. "You've caused enough trouble. Come out peacefully, and I promise you'll die quick." Miguel glanced at Clara, his dark eyes grim. "He's not planning to take prisoners. I figured that out." Clara replied, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "Miguel, do you have an extra gun?" He handed her a revolver, showing her quickly how to load and aim it. "Point and squeeze, don't jerk the trigger. And Clara, if they overrun us, save the last bullet for yourself." Clara nodded, understanding the harsh reality of their situation. But as she checked the cylinder of the revolver, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Kansas, a sense of fighting for something that mattered, of standing up to bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted through violence and intimidation. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. It wasn't the romantic, heroic affair depicted in dime novels, but a grinding, terrifying battle of attrition where every shot had to count, and every mistake could be fatal. Miguel proved to be a formidable marksman, his shots forcing Amos's men to keep their heads down and preventing them from advancing on the rock formation. But Clara could see that they were gradually being surrounded with gunmen, working their way around both flanks of their position. "Miguel," she called during a brief lull in the firing, "they're trying to get behind us." "I know. We need to break out before they complete the circle." But even as he spoke, Clara could see more riders approaching from the direction of the ranch. Amos had called in every man he could muster, turning their desperate stand into a small war. Then, just when the situation seemed hopeless, Clara heard something that made her heart leap, the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the north, accompanied by voices shouting commands. Miguel's friends had arrived, and they weren't alone. "Federal marshals," a voice boomed across the pasture. "Throw down your weapons and surrender." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of Amos's hired gunmen threw down their rifles and raised their hands, clearly unwilling to fight federal law enforcement. Others tried to run, spurring their horses toward distant hills and whatever safety they might find there. But Amos himself seemed to have reached a point beyond rational thought. Instead of surrendering, he charged directly at the rock formation, where Clara and Miguel were hidden, his rifle blazing and his face twisted with rage and desperation. Miguel rose from behind his cover to meet the charge. But Amos's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the rocks. Clara saw her protector fall and knew with sickening certainty that she was on her own. Amos vaulted from his horse and advanced on foot, reloading his rifle as he came. "Sister," he shouted, the word dripping with venom. "Time to join our dear father." Clara raised the revolver Miguel had given her, her hands shaking, but her resolve firm. "Stop right there, Amos. It's over. The marshals are here." Amos laughed, a sound devoid of any sanity. "You think I care about marshals? You think I care about anything now? You've destroyed everything I worked for, everything I sacrificed for. If I can't have the ranch, then nobody can." He brought his rifle to his shoulder, aiming directly at Clara's heart. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger and knew she had perhaps a second before he fired. Clara squeezed the trigger of her revolver just as Amos fired his rifle. The two shots echoed across the pasture simultaneously, and for a moment time seemed suspended, neither of them moving. Then Amos staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest with an expression of surprised confusion. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, then collapsed onto the frozen ground. Clara remained frozen behind her cover. The smoking revolver still pointed at where Amos had been standing. She couldn't quite believe that the nightmare was finally over, that the brother she'd never known had tried to kill her, and that she'd been forced to kill him in return. The federal marshals reached them within minutes, followed by Miguel's friends, and to Clara's surprise, several townspeople from Dead Crow Basin. The story of what had been happening at Hallowell Ranch had finally gotten out, and public opinion had turned decisively against Amos and his methods. Marshal Hendricks, a grizzled veteran with kind eyes and a gentle manner, knelt beside Clara as she sat numbly on the ground next to Miguel, who was being tended by one of the townsmen with medical experience. "Miss Hallowell, I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. Miguel Santos sent word about your situation, and we came as quickly as we could." Clara looked up at the marshal, feeling drained and empty. "Is he dead?" Marshal Hendricks glanced toward where Amos's body lay covered with a blanket. "Yes, ma'am. And from what we've pieced together so far, he won't be missed by many folks around here." Over the next several hours, as the scene was documented and witness statements were taken, the full scope of Amos's crimes began to emerge. The evidence Clara and Miguel had found at the death site, combined with testimony from Pete Daniels and other ranch hands who'd been too frightened to speak, before painted a clear picture of fraud, extortion, and murder. Pete, in particular, seemed relieved to finally tell the truth about what he'd witnessed. "I knew it was wrong," he told Marshal Hendricks. "But Amos, he had a way of making people afraid to cross him. He wasn't just violent, he was smart about it, made it look like accidents or natural causes. Even Sheriff Bale, faced with federal investigators and overwhelming evidence, admitted to his financial relationship with Amos and his willingness to look the other way when inconvenient questions arose. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Rosa Gutierrez, who had finally decided that staying silent was no longer an option. "I saw him burn the letters," she told the marshals. "Clara's letters to her father. Amos would take them from the mail and burn them in the kitchen stove, laughing about how the old fool thought his daughter had forgotten him. As the investigation continued, Clara found herself torn between relief that the truth was finally coming out and grief for the family she'd never had a chance to know. Amos had been her half-brother, twisted by resentment and abandonment into something monstrous, but still her father's son. 3 days later, with Amos buried in the local cemetery and most of his hired gunmen either in custody or run out of the territory, Clara stood in the main room of Hallowell Ranch and tried to decide what to do with her inheritance. The ranch was heavily in debt. Many of the cattle had been sold off to fund Amos's schemes, and the buildings needed extensive repairs. But as Clara walked through the house where her father had lived and died, she began to see possibilities rather than just problems. Rosa appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained anxiety. "Mia, have you decided what you're going to do? Some of the men, they're worried about their jobs." Clara accepted a cup of coffee and smiled at the older woman who'd shown her such kindness. "Rosa, what would you think about turning this place into more than just a cattle ranch?" "What do you mean?" "I mean a place where people who need a second chance can come to find work and shelter. Women like me who've been driven from their homes by scandal or violence. Men like Pete who've made mistakes but want to do better. Maybe even former outlaws who are ready to live honest lives." Rosa's face lit up with understanding and approval. "Your father, he would have loved that idea. He always said this land was too big for just one family, that it should be shared with people who needed it." Miguel, his arm in a sling but otherwise recovered from his wound, appeared in the doorway behind Rosa. "It's a good plan, Clara, but you'll need help making it work. This is still rough country, and there will always be people who don't like the idea of giving second chances. Are you offering to help?" Miguel smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Clara had seen from him. "I owed your father a debt. Maybe working with you to fulfill his dreams is how I pay it back." Clara looked around the room where so much violence and deception had taken place, then walked to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered valley that stretched to the horizon. Dead Crow Basin. The name had seemed ominous when she'd first arrived, but now she wondered if it might represent something different, a place where dead dreams could be reborn, where people could shed their past mistakes and start fresh. 6 months later, Clara stood in the same spot and surveyed a very different scene. The ranch now housed 15 people, including 3 families and several single men and women who'd come seeking the second chance Clara offered. They raised cattle, but they also grew crops, operated a small school for the children, and maintained a workshop where furniture and tools were made for sale in surrounding towns. Pete Daniels had become the ranch foreman, his guilt over his silence during Amos's reign transformed into fierce loyalty to Clara and determination to protect the sanctuary she'd created. Dmitry Volkov used his knowledge of horses to start a breeding program that was beginning to show promise. And even Jake Morrison, fully recovered from his accident, had decided to stay and contribute his skills as a carpenter. Miguel had accepted a position as a deputy marshal again, but he made the ranch his headquarters, using it as a base for his circuit through the territory. His presence provided security and legitimacy to Clara's experiment in second chances. Rosa remained as the heart of the operation, her kitchen now feeding a small community, and her wisdom guiding many of the decisions that shaped their daily lives. She'd also received word that her daughter Maria, whom she'd thought lost forever, was alive and working as a seamstress in Denver. Plans were already in motion for a reunion that would bring yet another family together under Clara's roof. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself. The frightened schoolteacher who'd arrived in Dead Crow Basin fleeing false accusations had been transformed into a confident woman who'd faced down killers, built a community, and found her place in the world. As she watched the sun set over the valley, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Clara thought about the letter she'd written that morning to Marshal Hendricks, accepting his offer to make her an official deputy marshal. It was time to take her mission of providing second chances beyond the boundaries of Hallowell Ranch, to help other people in other places who needed someone to believe in them. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to a lone rider, making his way up the valley toward the ranch. As the figure drew closer, Clara could see it was a woman riding alone and carrying what appeared to be all her possessions in saddlebags and a bedroll. Another lost soul seeking sanctuary, Clara thought with satisfaction. Another chance to prove that people could change, that redemption was possible, and that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose, rather than the ones you were born into. She walked down from the porch to meet the newcomer, her hand extended in welcome, and her heart full of hope for whatever story this new arrival might bring to the growing community of Hallowell Ranch. Behind her, warm light spilled from the windows of the house, and the sounds of conversation and laughter carried on the evening air. It was the sound of home, a people who'd found their place in the world and were determined to help others do the same. In the distance, the wind carried the faint echo of what might have been voices, her father's perhaps, and even Amos's, finally at peace with the choices they'd made and the legacy they'd left behind. Clara paused for a moment to listen, then smiled and continued walking toward her future, ready to write the next chapter in the story of Dead Crow Basin and the people who'd found their second chances in its harsh, beautiful landscape. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to let fear and hatred define her destiny. Clara Hallowell had come to claim an inheritance and had discovered something far more valuable. The knowledge that every ending could be a new beginning, and every moment was a choice. Between love and hate, between building up and tearing down, she'd chosen love. She'd chosen to build. And in doing so, she'd honored her father's memory while creating something entirely her own. A place where the dead could rest in peace, and the living could find the courage to hope again.